We welcome back Chris Henry. Chris is the director of the EA Museum and a good friend of mine. Chris, actually, I called him 2 weeks ago and said, "Hey, I speaker drop out. Are you available?" He said, "I just got a new briefing on Frank Borman, and I'd love to give it to you guys." So, Chris, the floor is yours.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for everything you do here at EA for us, and I'm really honored to call you a friend as well. So, and very honored to be here talking to you guys today. This is a special one. As I joked about that, this is a dry rehearsal. I do use you guys for a lot of dry rehearsals because I figure if it passes your checks, that it must be all right. So, thank you guys for helping me with that. This one is a really personal one. I try to only give ones that are personal or that I have a different tie to, simply because, for example, I talk about the space program as a whole. There are lots of educated people with firsthand information who are actually there working at that give lectures. So I always try to make sure my lecture differs somehow. Like, why is this one different? And for example, my lecture about the space program is about literally the time that I spent with the astronauts one on one and got stories from them. So same thing. Frank Borman is someone who there are tons of different books that are out about specifically Apollo 8, Frank's autobiography. But what you're going to hear is the stories that Frank told me, and I kind of made that into the history of his life using the stories that he shared with me. I was very fortunate and lucky to get to spend a large amount of time with him. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. A little bit about Frank's back history, and then we'll wind up actually walking the grounds of EA Oshkosh with him. Um, but Frank started out life born. Let me make sure it's working. Here we go. Born actually in Gary, Indiana, even though he eventually called Arizona his home. He was born in Gary. He was born March 14th, 1928. He only lived there a short period of time because his sinuses were really bothered by the climate there. Now, you think about this. This is 1928 that he's born. So you're looking at the time period of the Great Depression. His dad was a car dealer, car salesman for Oldsmobile. You were lucky enough to have a job during the Great Depression. You didn't want to do anything to mess with that, right? Well, Frank's father saw that his son was suffering. They had gone to a lot of different specialists, and the specialists all said, your son isn't going to get any better unless you take him to a different climate. So they actually did move to Arizona, um, just outside of Tucson, to try to help with his sinuses, which it did help. But that took a lot of courage on his dad's part, on his parents' part, that you're going to upset your whole life. Basically, but you're going to do it so that your child can have a better life. What they weren't there too long. They moved there in the early 30s, and shortly after that, of course, Pearl Harbor. That changes everything. Like I said, anybody who was alive at that time period, December 7th, 1941, changed everything in the United States and really globally. His parents, his mom came from the home front, and his dad left the dealership to start working on aircraft. They actually went to work on the assembly line at Consolidated Vultee. They helped build Mustangs and some B-24s, and few other items for the war effort. While they were there, this is when Frank was able to actually go up for his first airplane ride, and he just loved it. He knew right away that this is what he wanted to do. Um, he tried out for football while he was in junior high, and in junior high, he didn't make it. They said he wasn't good enough, and there was a band of a few kids that they were turned down. They all said, they weren't good enough to make the football team. A lot of people would just kind of hang it up at that point and say, "Well, I gave it a shot." Not Frank. Frank got ticked off that he felt these kids weren't being allowed to play, so he actually went around, gathered up the kids that didn't make the team, and made his own team. He then went to a local jeweler who sponsored the team, and again made their own football team. Eventually, he kind of wore down the local high school doing this. That they said, "Okay, fine, you're on the football team. Uh, you can be our backup quarterback." For money, he was a local paper boy, and shortly after that, as he was getting into high school, he met a young woman there named Susan Bugby, and Susan uh, just from the time that they met, that was his person. Frank just fell head over heels for her. She eventually became homecoming queen. She did some local model work. Just a really, really wonderful person and very, very sweet demeanor. She had lost her father early in life when she was a kid, so it was just her and her mom. And again, that was a rough thing for them to encounter. Frank was a big model builder, built a lot of flying airplanes and static. Just loved it. He built plastic models, rubber band powered stuff, eventually RC stuff later on in life. While he was over at a friend's house, um, his friend's father asked him, "What is your plans for after high school? What are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. I haven't figured it out yet." He said, I'd love to go to like one of the military universities, but I don't have a tie to get in there. And my grades they're not bad, but they're not, straight A's or anything like that. And they said, "Well, what would you consider West Point?" And he said, "Well, I would, but I don't have a connection." Well, his friend's father had a connection to a congressman, Richard Harless. And Richard Harless said, "I will list him as my third alternate if the first two drop out." Well, what happened was the war ends. The idea of joining the military changes. A lot of people had had enough of the military service. They didn't. They were ready for peacetime. They didn't want to go after that. So his first two choices actually dropped out of their selection to go to West Point. So Frank Borman got to go to West Point. He started July 1st, 1946. He would become the class of 50. It was tough at West Point, very tough. It took all of his dedication, all of his concentration, and several of the instructors at West Point told their cadets that you do not have time for girlfriends or significant others. And if you do have a girlfriend or whatever, you owe it to them to break it off and focus on your studies. And Frank did that and broke up with Susan. And he didn't break up with her for very long, but they were apart for a while. And he was miserable. He eventually started writing letters to her, and she would write back. Um, she had started sort of lightly seeing somebody else, and Frank said, "That's enough." He graduated June 6th of 50, and right away, he actually ranked eighth in his class, by the way, of 670. He made a beeline for Tucson, where Susan was. And he gets there, and he asks Susan to dinner. And they go to dinner at an Italian restaurant, and he asks her right there to marry him. And she said, "Yeah. However, there's two things we got to figure out. One is you have to come over and ask my mom for her hand, or her permission, to marry me. And then I have to break it off with this guy that I've kind of been seeing a little bit. It's not serious, but I owe him that." So she goes home that night and she calls this gentleman and says, I just wanted to let you know, like I'm marrying Frank Borman. He had offered me uh, his hand in marriage, and I accepted. Um, the guy didn't take it great, and she had basically said, "Well, it's all done. He's coming over to morning to talk to my mom, and we're it is what it is." So the next morning, Frank shows up to ask Susan's mom permission to marry her, and he has a window to do this. He's on leave, so he has to like get this all together and going. While he's in there trying to talk to Susan's mom in the living room, the gentleman who Susan had been seeing showed up and started yelling at Frank to come out and basically fight him. Frank ran out of the living room door, knocked the guy out in the living room, ran back into the house and said, "Well, can I have your permission or not?" And it was funny because they said they were looking out the window and there's this guy just knocked out cold in the front yard. And Susan's mom said, "Well, I guess you really love my daughter. I'll give you permission." So they got married July 20th, 1950, and then that was it. It was military life from then on. So quickly after that, they deployed to a few different Air Force bases throughout Arizona and California. Frank qualified to fly fighters. That was really what he wanted to do. So he started training in the T-6. That would be one of the last propeller-driven aircraft he'd fly because it would be into the new jet technology soon. And that was a time period where, the jets were new. We were having some teething problems with our jets. We had the P-59, and the P-59 did okay. I mean, it certainly performed as a jet aircraft, but I would argue that it wasn't the most out of this world airplane. And then, as a matter of fact, that whole project with the jet technology got moved to Lockheed, where they made the P-80, and that's where Frank and the jet sort of crossed paths. Um, this is shortly after they were married that they had their first child, Frederick. He was born October 51. And shortly after that, Frank actually earns his fighter pilot's wings, December 4th, 1951. And then is assigned to the new T-30, or I'm sorry, P-80 Shooting Star. Um, he goes out to try to test the aircraft out. He's so excited to fly it, even when he wasn't feeling well, he'd still push through his missions. And while practicing gunnery out on a bombing range at Nellis, he was flying with a head cold and actually burst his eardrum. And I can imagine how painful that had to been. So he's off flight rotation. He's now assigned to desk duty and then gets deployed with the 44th Fighter Squadron. And they're going to go to the Philippines. They're not going to go to Korea. These guys were being sent to the Philippines. And Frank is going to be a desk jockey there, which he was not happy about. And he had voiced to Susan that he thought he would, if he can't get back on the flight rotation, that he was going to serve out this line of duty, and then him and Susan would figure out what his career was going to be, but it wasn't going to be in the military. Um, he got on board a steamer December 20th of 51 and was heading to the Philippines. And he said, Susan was back at home, and he said, we'll figure this out, how you're going to get here or how we're going to do this. We'll figure it out, because they didn't have the money for him to have Susan out there. He was going to be based at Clark Air Force Base. The military at that time necessarily wouldn't pay to get sent Susan out. So he boarded this ship. He says, we'll figure this out, but let me get over there and get established. Well, he gets to Clark Air Force Base, and they tell him where his housing is. And they're like, "Wow, I have an actual house on the base." And that was because Susan, while he was on the ship, had sold the family Oldsmobile and bought two airline tickets to Clark and flew her and her son out there and beat Frank to Clark Air Force Base and set up a house for them there. So by the time he got there, he already had housing. So if that gives you any sort of idea what kind of a person Susan is, that is exactly. She was one heck of a person. And honestly, without Frank, she would be kind of lost. And I think Frank was the same way. Their love life, their love story was just absolutely adorable. And we'll talk more about that. Frank gets there and immediately is greeted with his commanding officer, the 44th, and that was Charles McGee. Charles McGee, of course, famous for being a Tuskegee Airman, flew red tail Mustangs in World War II. Um, Frank says we go in to meet him that first day, and I'll clean this story up just slightly. But he said we go in to meet him the first day, and we're already kind of intimidated because we knew what he had been through. We knew that he had to fight just to get into the war, and that we knew that once he was in the war, he had racked up kills. This is someone we're looking at who's a combat veteran. So we were in awe of him. And he said he's at his desk writing, and the four new pilots get there, and Charles McGee looks up and he says, "A lot of squadron commanders will tell you that you play ball with me, and I'll play ball with you." And he says, "You play ball with me, or I'm going to take the bat, I'm going to stick it somewhere unpleasant, and I'll let you guys figure out where that might be." And Charles, he said, I never forgot that about Charles McGee. Um, Susan is there. They have a second a son born July of 52, Edwin. And think about this. Susan is the wife of a fighter pilot flying jets, early jets, just basically out of the test phase. That's not an easy life. Being a military wife or military spouse is not easy, regardless of what they're flying. But when they're flying something maybe a bit more dangerous, it certainly isn't any easier. And she has her out. Frank's eardrum, he's grounded. This is a way for them to maybe leave the military and have what I would call more conventional, easier life, right? But she doesn't do that. Frank comes home one day and he was pretty dejected about his ear, and he'd had a rough day of just being on the ground. And he said, Susan, I think I've had it. Maybe we just call it quits now and I can get medicaled out. And she said, Frank, this is your dream, to fly, and I'm not going to let you give up on your dream. And she actually went and met with Charles McGee one on one, and she had told him what was going on. Um, they had found a place that would do a sort of experimental healing technique on the eardrum. Um, he did try it. It did heal the eardrum, but not necessarily like as thick as it should be. And Charles McGee said, "Well, let's go see what we can do." So September 22nd, 1952, Frank and Charles McGee took a T-33 up, and they actually performed the dive bombing routine and things like that he would have to do. They came back, they went and saw their medical officer, and the flight surgeon said, "Well, it's still not where I think it should be, so I won't return him to flight." And Charles McGee said, "You will return him to flight." And that's an order. And Frank was returned to flight status. Without Susan and without Charles McGee, there is no astronaut Frank Borman. And that was something that Frank told me as a direct quote. That he would forever be indebted to both of them for pushing through to get him returned to status. He then started flying different types of jets, not only the P-80, but also a lot of the Century Series aircraft. Um, he, along the way, attended Caltech, Cal Institute of Technology, received a Master's of Science degree in aeronautical engineering. And in June of 52, he actually became an assistant professor of thermodynamics and fluid mechanics at West Point. So shortly after doing a stint there, he was assigned to the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School. He actually attended there first, and that was June of 60, and then he was selected to become an instructor there. While he was there, his first class included Michael Collins and Jim Irwin, other obviously famous astronauts. And his boss, after he graduated and started actually working there as an instructor, was General Chuck Yeager, who he admired. He enjoyed working for. Said he was tough but very fair, and he said, you know, General Yeager wouldn't ask you to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. But again, he continued working through that program. Um, Flew a lot of different aircraft like the P-80, got a lot of testing done on the P-80, showing improvements on how we can change the aircraft, make it a bit safer, and then got to fly some pretty significant airplanes like the F-104, basically everything in the Century series. And then at his kitchen table, they knew they had to try to figure out something to help test basically aircraft are going to be going beyond the atmosphere. So at his kitchen table one night, a bunch of them got together and they came up with the idea for the NF-104. So this thing would be flown up above where the jet engine couldn't get oxygen any longer. They would shut that engine down and fire this rocket engine that they would modify. They'd put in the tail. It actually had thrusters in the nose. Quite a machine. They only ever built a few of them. And I believe there's two that survive. One for sure at Edwards. I believe the other one is actually, oddly enough, in a pole in California as well. So I think those are the only two left. But of course, there was a famous crash that you see depicted in The Right Stuff when General Yeager had an issue with it. So, but this was a good, an amazing test platform. Frank never got to fly the NF-104 as far as I know, but it was designed in his kitchen though. Then April 18th of 1962, Frank well, it was formally announced by NASA that they were going to be accepting applications for more astronauts. They needed to expand beyond Mercury, and the Mercury 7 was obviously world famous by that point. Frank wanted to push on and keep pushing his career, and he thought, I want to see what I can do to try to help the country at NASA. A lot of people felt that we were still behind the power curve of Sputnik, and that was something that a lot of guys took for real. This was a Cold War fight, and if I can help our country pull ahead of Russia, that we should. And Frank felt that way for sure. Borman was selected in September to be part of the new nine or the next nine, and their project was going to be Gemini. Gemini was going to be the focus of these guys coming into the program. This was going to be a lot different than Mercury. For people that are not docents at the Air and Space Museum, I generally try to explain to people that Mercury, it was all a stepping stone. Mercury was, can we do this? Can we fly in space? Gemini was very much, okay, we can fly in space. We know we can send somebody up and get them back. Now, what can we do once we're up there? Can we get out of the spacecraft? Can we dock up? Can we meet up in space? How long can we stay up there? And then, of course, Apollo was going to be the moon landings and everything we can do on the moon. Um, Frank, again, one of the new nine, and each of the new nine was assigned a different area that they were going to sort of try to develop expertise in that could help. Borman's assignment was to study and learn everything he could about the Titan II booster. So he really spent a lot of time with that. The wild thing is a lot of these photos you see, like for example, that model next to Frank, we literally have that model in our collection. So it's really wild when you see a lot of the stuff that he posed with that we later turned up having, which is kind of fun. Um, Upon selection at NASA, he moved his family to Houston. They bought their first house that was actually going to be built for them in that neighborhood you always hear about that all the astronauts lived in Houston. That house cost $26,000, which was a pretty nice house at that time period. Um, so let's talk about the car here for a second. That's Frank and Susan washing their Impala. I asked Frank once. I said, a lot of the astronauts were famous for having the Corvettes. Did you have a Corvette? And he never had a Corvette. He goes, what would I do with a Corvette? I had a family. So they had a Chevy Impala and a pickup truck. So he said, I never docked anybody for points for taking that deal. The Corvette's a pretty car, but I just didn't have a need for one. So the astronauts, you get selected, and then it's time for classroom work. You're going to do classroom work, just tons of it. And then I think for about 4 months, they were given nothing but classroom. And then you had to learn about propulsion, orbital mechanics, astronomy, computing, space medicine, anything you can think of. And then they had to go do other stuff than classroom work. Suddenly, they were like, just when we were really bored and we couldn't take any classroom work, they said, we're going to give you guys a break from classroom work, only to give us something that we would prefer to be back in the classroom. And they put them on survival training. So they would take them out somewhere, dump them off, and tell them they have to get from point A to point B. Here's some supplies. You got to make this last, and then they would observe them. So these are parachutes that they had made into to robes. I think they're trying to strike a pose there to show off just how fashionable these looked. But they also did geology training. People like Dr. Leon Silver, who would really later become really important to things like the Apollo 15 mission, but they were making sure they knew how to get samples and do basic geology training. This infuriated Frank. I won't kid you. He said, "I'm there to fight the Russians. I want to go up and fly missions and start getting America caught up to them." And we're out there picking up rocks, and it really made me mad. He goes, I didn't want to do that. So uh, along the way, he became friends with Ed White. Ed White became his best friend, as a matter of fact. They were very close. They spent a lot of evenings together. Both Ed and Pat, who's his wife, along with Frank and Susan, would spend a large amount of time in their downtime together in the evenings. Um, his boss would be Chief of Flight Crew Operations, Deke Slayton. Deke himself, original Mercury 7 astronaut who got removed because of a medical issue. But he originally, Frank's first mission, thought, I'm going to put you with Gus Grissom. And so originally they were going to be a prime crew for Gemini 3. And he said, I got invited to Gus's house one night for dinner. And he said, it was a very nice dinner, and I thought it went well. But the next day, Gus felt that he gelled more with John Young, and he goes, and I took no offense to it. Just it is what it is. You feel, that this is what's better for the mission. So Grissom would end up flying with John Young, but Deke didn't waver from assigning Frank a flight, and soon he was assigned to the Gemini 7 mission. So Borman was assigned as commander, and now Borman got to basically host the dinner party and see if he gelled well with which crew members. And him and Jim Lovell really gelled well, so he picked Jim Lovell to go with him. Deke approved it, and they flew again Gemini 7 together, which we'll talk about Gemini in just a second here. So they actually had Ed White and Mike Collins as their backup crew for this one, by the way. And they were expecting that maybe an Apollo mission, hopefully in the future, so this was going to be a good sort of thing for them to gel on. But they knew that a moon trip was going to be at least about a week, right? They knew that it was somewhere around that area. So the idea was to send Gemini 7 up and see how long they could stay up. And they were going to send them up there for 2 weeks. That was the plan. And they wanted to see how long the components could operate in space, how the crew would do up there that long. Now, let's talk about the inside of a Gemini 7 capsule. You're talking about 2 weeks. You're not talking about 2 weeks on a shuttle or even the Apollo capsule, which has some more, room to move around a little bit. Everybody, and I know you guys have all heard this comparison that it's the size of the front seat of your Volkswagen Bug is what they always said. But looking at this, I mean, it is generally the size of the front seat of an SUV, right? I mean, that's it. You're not floating around the cabin. You're pretty much seat belted down. Not a lot of fun to go in for 2 weeks. Maybe a quick up and down like a Mercury mission wouldn't be that bad, but this was going to look pretty rough. The Agena and Gemini 6 were supposed to fly a mission earlier, and the Agena actually had a problem and blew up downrange. So now they were saying, well, Gemini 6 is supposed to fly first. They don't have anything to dock with. And they got the idea of why not launch 6 and have them meet up with 7, and they can go and station keep, and we don't lose time on the mission. That's exactly what they did. This is breakfast that morning before they're getting ready to go, having a protein breakfast, it looks like. Pete Conrad is animated there doing something. I'm not sure what they're doing. But there's Frank on the end. And then they were wearing special suits for this mission. They were actually a new suit for this Gemini flight. And this is them. That's Jim Lovell actually walking out there now with it, or up front there with it. They launched December 6, 1965. And for the first time, Frank had taken like a really good camera, and they were taking these beautiful shots from up there that they were able to get really high definition photos from the Gemini capsule. I couldn't imagine you're on this amazing journey and then you have to remember to pull out a camera and document it with photos. But and they actually got a photo class, by the way. They actually were taught how to take photos different. At that time, it wasn't all digital. They had to actually know the manual settings on the cameras and everything like that. During this time of the flight, it was the Army-Navy game was going on. Frank was the only guy on either of the two spacecraft that had gone to West Point. The rest were all Navy guys. So when Gemini 6, seen here, shows up, they have a Beat Army sign in the window. And Frank said, I knew that was Wally messing around with me. And he said, so I keyed the mic and I said, oh, look, there's a sign that says Beat Navy in the window. And he said, the sign disappeared for a second and then it came back. And he goes, and that was Wally. He pulled it down to double check the sign to make sure it was the right sign. After that, they stayed up there with him for just a little bit. Then they peeled off, and now it was time. They proved that you can station keep. You can basically formation fly. And now Gemini 7 had to spend the rest of that 2-week flight up there by themselves. Jim Lovell at one point lost his toothbrush. Frank said we had to share a toothbrush for the rest of that mission. They got a song stuck in their head that they kept singing. And he said, his words, he said, if you fly a Gemini mission and you flew Gemini 7's profile specifically, you were either going to emerge best friends or mortal enemies. And he said, luckily, we emerged best friends. He said, but when we landed December 18th, 1965, the USS Wasp came out to get us. And he said, a frogman came and opened up the hatch for us. And he said, I think it smelled really bad in the capsule. He goes, because his eyes got as big as saucers when he opened it. When we landed on the deck, seen here, he said, I announced our engagement and everybody laughed. And he says, and then we had to walk down below deck. And he said, I remember I was so weak that I had to physically tell each leg to move. Like I remember having to command each foot to move. And he says, my mom and dad were watching it. And he said that my mom said I was walking like I had my pants full of something. So he said it was tough though. We were very weak. You know, I can't imagine being that tired. And that's exactly what it was. Gemini 7 had weakened them and it had taken more out of them than they thought. So, I mean, that was something we definitely learned from this was if you're going to be up there for 2 weeks, there has to be some sort of exercising or something that these guys could do and maybe better prep and, better preparation for the mission, and what can we do to keep these guys maybe a bit more lucid or not lucid, but loose, moving their muscles around. And also Frank said the food was horrible. So he said that didn't change his entire time in the space program. It didn't get any better. So um, Gemini, Mercury was really successful. Gemini, very successful. So we were building on these just absolute chains of amazingness. We had very little bad things happen to us through the start of our space program. So Apollo, leading into that, we were ready to go. I mean, let's this is it. We're going to go to the moon. Kennedy had promised we were going to do that before the end of the decade. It's time to go to work and get to the moon. We have a lot of what we need to get there. So it's time to start flying these missions to go, and that's Apollo. Apollo 1 would be Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee. And that sort of, I always say that sort of should dispel what you see in the Right Stuff movie, which really kind of followed Gus's legacy for a while, was that he was blackballed after the Mercury capsule sinking thing. If he really was, he would have never flown Gemini, and he certainly wouldn't be commanding the first Apollo mission. But this was it. These guys are going to go out and test out the new capsule, and everything had gone pretty smooth. Gus had some issues with the capsule. What he didn't like was, back in the day, if there was something you wanted to change on a capsule, it was pretty easy to do. Apollo wasn't like that. It was just such a complex machine. A modification, or customization just couldn't happen that way. But other than that, I mean, it wasn't horrible. I mean, it was a teething problem. It was a learning lesson. Gus did get vocal sometimes where he got frustrated. Um, it was time to do what they call the plugs in test, and the backup crew did that. Uh, Successful, but they were having some communications issues. It was time for the plugs out test. The prime crew was going to do that, and this was basically making sure the spacecraft could sustain its own power, sitting on the pads. This is not engines running. This is just electrical, and trying to come over these communications issues. And on January 27th, they were doing a plugs out test, and a fire swept through the spacecraft. The best they know, a spark jumped from a frayed wire down by their feet, jumped out into the pure oxygen environment that they were testing in. The pure oxygen was also tuned up to a high pressure to simulate spaceflight. And with that, the fire swept through there in seconds, really. I think it ruptured the hull of the spacecraft in something like 30 seconds. We lost our first 3 astronauts, and we haven't left the pad yet. I mean, that's pretty bleak for this program, especially considering the successes we've had prior to that. Frank was going to be placed on the review board. It was called the AS-204 Accident Review Board. And what was going on was NASA was basically saying it wasn't their fault. North American was saying it wasn't their fault. And the American government said, well, we need to get to the bottom of it, A, to figure out what happened, and then B, how do we get a path forward? And there were some politicians that said, should we go forward? Should the space program just end? It's too dangerous and it's too expensive. And basically both sides, the spacecraft company and NASA, were saying, who's going to lead the review board, because we don't trust you to lead it. And the other person would say, well, we don't trust you to have a person to lead it. And then they came up with the name Frank Borman, and both sides said, well, he'll shoot straight. He's not going to BS you. So Frank was placed as a lead on the AS-204 review board, Apollo 1 review board. Frank told me that in a car on his first day, James Webb told him, you're going to get pressure from both sides. I need you to understand something. He said, well, you're doing this. You don't work for anybody but Roger, Ed, and Gus. And he said, that's who you're working for. And whatever the outcome is, but you tell the truth, whatever the truth is. And Frank said, imagine a leader telling you that today, that doesn't matter if we're the ones that take the hit for it. If it's just, we take the hit, but you need to tell the truth. And Frank said, I always had a deep respect for him after that, and before that too, but that really always stuck with him. It was a 9-member review board. Think about this. This is the vehicle that your best friend was killed in. and you now have to go and work around it every day. You have to listen to the recordings of him dying. You have to sit in parts of the spacecraft he was in. Um, I couldn't imagine that. And to be honest, um, whether he ever acknowledged it or not, even later in life, he still hurt from it. And I remember when we went to go get the donation from him, he had a box on the shelf, a banker's box, and it just said Apollo 1 on it. And I just remember having chills um, being near that box without even knowing what was in the box. And eventually he donated that to us. And it took us a while on staff to open that box. I think we had to eventually because we had to list it for the donation. But and it was his report, it was his paperwork, it was his findings. A lot of it he saved copies and originals of. But it certainly weighed on me. He had it in place in his story in his closet that I remember. As soon as you open up the closet door, it was right there, just this box that said Apollo 1. Um, so he then had to go and testify before Congress, and he had to do it twice. And this was a quote that he told them when pressed about, you know, if we should continue to go forward. This was his quote: "We are trying to tell you that we are confident in our management, our engineering, and in ourselves. I think the question is really, are you confident in us?" He also really did call the whole thing a witch hunt. He used to laugh and he'd hold up that like his fingers like that. He'd say, I got to tell them that twice that just get out of our way. Let's go to the moon. Um, that they did. So after Apollo 1, everybody always asks, you guys know, there was an Apollo 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Those were unmanned tests. Apollo 7 was the first flight of the Block 2 command module. Still not on the main rocket, but they tested out the command module. That prime crew on Apollo 7 was the backup crew on Apollo 1. So we should never overlook the bravery of that backup crew, who then became the prime crew. The guys who flew before you died in a fire, and these guys turn around and say, "Okay, it's our turn. Let's go." That's brave. And now it's time for Apollo 8. Um, so they found out in August of '68 that the CIA had done some investigating that the Soviet Union was considering doing a lunar flyby by the end of the year, and nobody really loved that. Again, this was going to be a victory for Russia. We were trying to mitigate that. The command module and service module and the rocket were all ready. The lunar lander wasn't. The LEM wasn't quite ready yet. So they said, well, why don't we do this? Let's switch around the missions a little bit, and we're going to have Apollo 8 do a lunar flyby. It's ready, and we can beat them there, and we can get a victory. So that's exactly what they did. Crew chosen for this would be Frank Borman as commander. It would be Jim Lovell as the command module pilot. And then what would have been the lunar module pilot, but they didn't have a lunar module, would be Bill Anders. But Bill Anders was actually going to go and do some experiments, photography, things like that, still study the systems that he would need to do the flight. So he wasn't just going along for a free ride, even though I will say Frank used to joke with him about that. So um, there came a tough time where him and Susan had to have a talk, though, because along the way, Deke Slayton said, I need you to understand something about Apollo 8. There's a lot of firsts. We figured out that there's probably about a 30% chance that you're going to make it. You need to have a talk with Susan and your family as if you want to take this mission. And Frank went back, talked with Susan, but he also said, Susan was extremely uneasy. But this is what we signed up for. It was our job, and we owed it to our country. And he said this was a Cold War mission. We had to beat Russia. And he said, make no mistake, that's what Apollo 8 was. And so he talked to Susan. She understood the risk. She didn't like the risk. Susan once told me that she said along the mission, Deke came into the room and he said, Susan, things are going really good. I think there's a 50% chance they're going to make it back. And he was telling me this is good news. I don't think he realized how that sounded. But so let's talk about some of these first and why it was going to be pretty scary, right? 30% chance of making it home. Would you get in that car if you were going to take that ride to work? Probably not. Um, First flight of the Saturn V, first crewed flight of a Saturn V. So that Saturn V rocket is 7.5 million pounds of thrust. It's as tall as a 35-story building. Has enough power to send a 737 into lunar orbit. This is going to be the first crewed flight of one of these. They had a good test on it. They felt was a stable spacecraft or a stable rocket. First time they're going to leave low Earth orbit. First time we're going to park in lunar orbit. First time we have to do a burn out there in lunar orbit behind the moon, by the way. So not even in communication with mission control. And then the first time we have to do a burn to get out of lunar orbit and return home. There's a lot of areas where this can go wrong. And we're using computers in the 1960s. This is 68. So computers are as big as a room, not like today where the computing power is on one of our cell phones. So pretty scary time. Scary mission, but Frank said again, we owed it to the country. This is what we signed on for. We're going. They moved them out to the beach house a couple days before the launch, and they had a special visitor while they were there, and it was Charles Lindbergh. Charles and Anne-Marie Lindbergh came out to visit them at the beach house, and while they were there, they were talking about the spacecraft, and they actually started to do computing on the fuel burn of the Spirit of St. Louis and the Saturn V rocket. And what they came up with was the Saturn V rocket was going to burn every 10 seconds the entire amount of fuel that the Spirit of St. Louis had on board. And Charles Lindbergh was kind of blown away by that. But Lindbergh was a great supporter of the space program, as well as Apollo 8 specifically. This is just photos of them getting ready for that flight. I asked Frank, I said, Frank, you're sitting on top of this rocket. What are you thinking about? I mean, because I'm sure this thing has to be like belching and making noises and everything. And he said, I was sitting on top of that rocket on my back, looking out the window, and there was a seagull right outside my window, just kind of floating around in the thermals. And he said, when we lit that rocket off, I always wondered what happened to that seagull. And he said, I wish I was thinking of something more historic, but that's what was going through my mind. Um, let's talk about liftoff for a second. So by the manual, there's a T handle that the commander, Frank, should have had his hand on for the abort. In case there's an abort, there are rockets up here, retro rockets, will fire and would actually lift the command module off, almost like basically an ejection seat for the whole command module, deploy the parachutes and get the astronauts off safe in case there was some sort of catastrophe with the Saturn V. So you had to have your hand on this abort T handle. Frank said that the shaking was so violent inside that he had his hand off the T handle, and Bill Anders noticed. And Bill asked why he didn't have his hand on the T handle like you were supposed to. And Frank said, I'd rather die than make a false abort. He said, I was afraid that I was going to pull it accidentally in all the shaking. Bill Anders thought they had died on liftoff. He said it was so violent that I thought we blew up on the pad. But it was a pretty wild ride. As they left and they started staging, Frank said, I thought I knew how violent the staging would be, but I was wrong. He goes, it felt like you were being shot out of the front of the rocket and then thrown back in your seat. He goes, it got your attention. So um, that launch was December 21st, 1968. And that's it. They're leaving Earth. This is a photo from Apollo 8. And then they are heading to the moon. So they have to do a burn around the back side of the moon. And there's a lot. Frank was just such a serious guy. They wanted him to take a TV camera up and then do interviews, and Frank didn't want to do any of that. And Deke had to remind him that, Frank, this is a huge historic mission. You have to. Frank just wanted to do the mission, come back, and be done, and say, here's our report. It was a good mission. But that isn't what needed to happen on Apollo 8. So as a matter of fact, some people thought they ought to take a poet or an artist up, and Frank said, please no poets. So they leave Earth. On Frank's he had a pad, like I don't want to say a knee board, but he had sort of a knee board, and he literally on there would write different things along that clock. There's a clock, a mission clock that's running. And Frank literally would write, he wrote go for TLI, translunar injection, right at that time where they were going to do it. First time mankind is leaving low Earth orbit. They were going to have to go around the back end of the backside of the moon and do a burn back there. And nobody here on Earth was going to know if it was successful until they came around the backside of the moon, if it was successful. And this is a video, or I'm sorry, not video, but images of them waiting to find out back home. This is Susan and Jim Lovell's wife as well. And then Mary, I'm sorry, can't remember Jim Lovell's wife's name at the moment, but this is the Borman and Lovell's together, and then for both on the right before, and then on the left when they found them. But that's the moment they found out the burn was successful. The missions were not easy on Susan. Remember, she lost her dad early on. She had an interesting relationship with her mom. Frank was her person, and that should never be doubted or forgotten. So imagine your person is on this pretty hazardous mission. Um, they knew that they were going to have a moment where they should say something appropriate. As a matter of fact, that's what they were directed to do, is say something appropriate on this live broadcast they were going to do. But they weren't given anything else. Imagine the trust that NASA had, where they said, you're going to have more people than anything else listening and watching this, but we trust you to say something good, so go for it. We're not going to script anything for you. And they really kind of passed that around to a lot of people. What should we say? And then eventually, it was the wife of the minister for NASA that said, "You guys should read from the Book of Genesis," and that's what they did. Also, arguably the most famous photo taken from space, Earthrise, was taken by Bill Anders, even though there was a lot of joking around on the crew. When we had them here, it was funny because Jim Lovell said, yeah, Bill took the photo, but I showed him how to take pictures in space. And I'll never forget, Frank took his cell phone out and he says, we're going to call Bill Anders right now, and you're going to tell him that you taught him how to take pictures in space. But they did not plan on seeing this. They were actually scoping out future landing sites, and Bill Anders saw this out of the one window. A bunch of them took photos of it, but Bill's is arguably the most famous. And this is the wrong orientation. I did it this way on purpose. It actually should be tilted to the right or left, I can't remember. But I had it hanging this way in my office, and Frank was bothered by it. And he was like, it's hanging wrong. And I was like, yeah, I know, but it looks cool this way. And it was actually Dr. Jennifer Levasseur who came in to speak at Space Day, and she saw it, and her and I are friends. She didn't even ask. She just got up and then turned it the right way and hung it back on the wall the right way. So I viewed that as a thing of honor that was correctly curated by the one of the head curators of the Smithsonian. So, but again, think about that. I mean, when you get this photo in the 60s, nobody's ever seen anything like this. The mission went very smooth, considering all of the really first that they had to do. That the spacecraft just performed flawlessly for them. And they landed back on Earth December 27th, 1968. This is them on board, I believe the Hornet is what went and picked them up. And it was a huge celebration. I mean, it was ticker tape parades everywhere. It really helped bring the country together in a pretty rough time. 1968 was full of a lot of different political arguments and fights going on. It was a rough time in America. And 1968, we at least had this to rally behind. Frank actually got a lot of the telegrams that were passed to him for mission control, and Susan actually curated them. And then when they made the donation, those came to us. And the You Save 1968 one is actually still in the family. They wanted to keep that one, but there is one that was written, as I understand it, it gets passed around a little bit. I don't know what the actual name of the person was, but it was just a regular off the street person that sent a telegram to NASA that just said, "You saved 1968." I threw this photo in here because right after that, they get selected to go to Russia, the first American astronaut to visit Russia. And they go on a goodwill mission. This is them there. Susan and the kids got to go. And Frank said they assigned us this really wonderful attaché to usher us around. And it wasn't until we got back that we later found out she was KGB. He said, but oh, well, he said everybody was really nice to us while we were there. The cosmonauts were very wonderful. Spent a lot of time at the beach with them and actually invited them to their homes. He said it was really a warm reception and really sort of helped melt the space race. As a matter of fact, I always thought the space race went right up through Apollo 11, but if you think about it, shortly after Apollo, we started flying what do you want to call it? Um, we linked up with Sputnik, and I mean, pretty wild, right? That we were flying those the missions America and Russia together. That was shortly after Apollo. That wasn't that far. So I think that was pretty interesting. That, as a matter of fact, on Apollo 11, there was a time period where we had lost some tracking on Apollo 11, and Frank, with his relationships with Russia, was actually able to ask Russia if they still had tracking on it, and they actually came back and said, "Yep, we have it. We have that documentation." That Frank did get a reception from Russia that said, "Yep, we can still see it. We're tracking it too." So, um, speaking of Apollo 11, he was actually assigned to the president to be with Nixon and be a liaison to the president for the moon landing. So he spent the moon landing in the White House. And as a matter of fact, Nixon wanted the astronauts to say, I think either sing the national anthem or say the Pledge of Allegiance. And Frank basically shut that down, and he was like, "They don't have that kind of time. You can have a phone call, keep it quick, but they're not going to be able to do that kind of stuff." Frank stayed with the Apollo program, even though he was off flight rotation. He stayed with them through Apollo 13, and then after 13, he did leave and then went to work for Eastern Airlines. He actually eventually ran the company. He was originally hired as just a special advisor, and then eventually became senior vice president for them in December. The day after he takes office, December 29th, um, this actual airplane, this very one, crashed into, it was flight 401. It crashed into the Everglades. Frank is the new CEO for literally less than 24 hours. And he chartered a helicopter to take him to the crash scene, gets out, gets a swamp boat, and then actually goes out into the swamp and starts helping pick up survivors out of the swamp. Um, One survivor actually remembered that he wouldn't leave this one young woman, a young girl, in the hospital until they found her parents, and he sat with her in the hospital. Um, Imagine the president of the company doing that. This is the CEO, it's his first day, let alone leaving his office, but literally sitting in a hospital room all night with a young girl. It's the kind of guy Frank was. He wasn't going to sit there and watch the action go by. He ran the airline through actually a lot of its most profitable time. And then what happened was deregulation hit Eastern, and that was kind of the end. I mean, once that happened, Eastern was having a pretty hard time. They had to sell some assets. Frank tried to get them to hang on as long as he could. There were some labor issues, and he ended up resigning in '86. And then the airline would eventually be purchased. The employees thought so much of Frank, though, that when Eastern went out of business, they actually gave him the final American flag that flew over Eastern headquarters the last night of business. They wanted him to have it. And it was something that a lot of the employees wrote letters that it meant so much to him, he saved those letters. He then started restoring warbirds, restored P-51. He originally restored a single seat P-51, and then he did this two seat because Susan said she wanted to go with him. And he said, "Well, Susan, if we're going to wear parachutes and if anything ever happens, I have to trust that you'll bail out, because we'll bail out together." And she said, "Frank, I don't know if I can do it." And he says, "Well, then I can't bail out. I couldn't leave you." So she's in her 60s at this time period. And without telling him, she went down to the airport and took skydiving lessons. And on the day that she was going to do her jump, she said, "Frank, what are you doing today?" And he says, "Oh, I don't know." And she said, "Well, you should come down to the airport and watch me jump out of an airplane." And he was totally surprised. And that video is out there, by the way. I think it's floating around YouTube. And it's funny because it's very rare that Frank is just the bystander in the whole thing. It's pretty funny. All of his warbirds, his vintage aircraft were named Susu, and that was his nickname for Susan. This was his final Susu that he had, his T-34. Um, so you might ask, why am I giving a talk? How did I get involved with him? EA had a long relationship with the Apollo astronauts, many of them. We've had a couple reunions, one in the '90s, and then I got to lead one in 2017, where I had 9 Apollo astronauts plus Gene Kranz. And Frank So I first had an Apollo 13 reunion. It was just Apollo 13 folks. I had like five people. And so two astronauts plus a couple of the mission control guys. And shortly after that, it was time for Space Day here in October. And I'd asked Gene Kranz if he'd come be our speaker. And Gene said, "Oh man, I just accepted something in Houston, but I have a guy for you. He'll be great." And I get this phone call, and it's windy, so I couldn't really hear it. But this guy was saying that thing in October, I'll come and be your speaker. And I'm like, who the heck is this? And I said, I can't really hear you. So he got into the hangar and he goes, can you hear me now? And I said, yeah. And he goes, okay, that thing in October, I'll come and be your keynote. And I said, oh, that'd be great, but I didn't hear who you were. And he says, this is Frank Borman. And I'm just quiet for a second because I'm in awe. And he just goes, like Apollo 8. I'm like, oh God, like, no, I know who you are. Like, I just didn't expect to be on the phone with you. And I said, well, I'll get your airline tickets set up. And he says, nope, I'll fly my own T-34. And I said, are you sure? And I was talking to him. It was the evening, and it was this beautiful night. Sun or the moon was out, and he said, Chris, go outside for a second. And I did. And he goes, look up. And he says, you see that? And there's this beautiful full moon. And I said, yeah. And he goes, I found that in 1968. I think I can find Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And so he did. He arrived. We immediately went and had dinner, and I took him to a place that served us the worst apple crisp I've ever had. I don't know who made it, but it was not good. But I didn't want to offend him, so I'm just kind of being quiet. And he finally says, how's yours? And I said, it's really good. And he says, you're full of it. He goes, this is awful. And he goes, but at least they give you a lot of it. So long story short, on the Apple Crisp, he played a joke when we had the astronaut reunion. And he told all these astronauts he knew a place that had just fantastic Apple Crisp. And he'd make sure that they got some. And he actually got a tray of it and he brought it to the hotel to a special brunch we had. And he served it to all of them, knowing that it was not good and just waiting to hear all their reactions. And he says, "Oh, this is homemade," and he had this whole story made up about how it was a mom and pop place and everything. And none of the astronauts wanted to offend him, but I'd be driving with them somewhere, and one of them would say, like, that apple crisp was not good. And I don't know why Frank was so excited about it. And at the end of the day, he had gotten a joke in on them. There's a phrase that permeates out there that says, "Never meet your heroes because you'll be disappointed." Whoever made that phrase didn't work here at EAA, and he certainly didn't have Frank Borman as a hero, because I always tell everybody that phrase is completely incorrect. Go meet your heroes. A, chances are they're cooler than you think. And B, if they're not good, then maybe they're not your hero after all, right? So Frank lived up to just everything you thought he would be. During that space day, there was a young girl who wanted to ask questions to the astronaut if he was going to be there, and she was going to come to the talk. And she's pretty young. This is her here, and Frank heard that there was a young girl that wanted some direction in her career, which is true. She wanted to be an astronaut, and then wanted to know what classes she should take to become an aeronautical engineer. I didn't even know what an aeronautical engineer was when I was this girl's age. And Frank was like, well, I need to come over. And he wasn't supposed to speak until 5 o'clock. And he spent the entire day with us. He came at 10 a.m., spent the whole day doing experiments with the kids, talked to this young lady, talked to all of them. Then, of course, went and did his talk. A lot of people would show up, say, what time do you want me? And then they would sit in the hotel until that time. And not Frank. He was going to be part of the whole deal. This was our reunion that we had when we had the big group reunion in 2017. And these two, Jim Lovell and Borman together, sat next to each other, and they could have had their own variety show. They were absolutely hilarious. And they really kind of stole the show. They were best friends up until we lost both of them. They talked routinely. They kept in touch. They were best friends. And Anders was too. They were tight with him too. So when you talk to one of them, the other one would say, "Well, I'm going to talk to him later. I'll let him know." I mean, it was seamless like that. Shortly after that, we get a call, and Frank said, "You don't really have any space artifacts in your museum. Is that because you don't want them, or is that because you never had the option to get them?" And it was the later. And he says, "Well, I'd like to donate a few items to you. So would you come out to my ranch in Montana and get them?" And we said, "Absolutely." And when we got there, we had a van. He said, "Well, I'm just going to give you a few things." And we got there, and Frank said, "I've decided I want to give it all to you." So we came home with what we had thought was going to be about 30 artifacts, and we came home with 1,000 individual pieces, and just absolutely amazing. And what we did was we recorded step by step him telling us what each one was, and we'd video it. That way, we had a log of what each item was. While we were there, we got snowed into his ranch, which was kind of hilarious. So we had to try to dig out once we got loaded. And in Montana, when it snows, man, it snows, and just like even worse than Wisconsin. By the way, if anybody likes Yellowstone, this was like a half hour away from where they film Yellowstone now. And we got our truck stuck in his neighbor's yard, which he absolutely loved. This was the townhouse that he had in town in Billings, because his neighbor was like he was really big on keeping his yard clear and clean and pampered. And Frank just thought it was hilarious that we got our truck stuck in that guy's yard. We brought it back. We built the exhibit with a lot of heart. The people who built this exhibit were the same people that actually went out there to get the artifacts, that spent time with Frank. Um, it honestly will always be one of the highlights of my career. And we had Frank here for the opening. It was the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8. He was here as our Wright Brothers speaker. Frank was mission driven and schedule driven. So we have this red tape, and we pull out, for red ribbon for him to cut. And just as we're about to say a few words, Frank is like, "All right, let's get it open." And he takes these big scissors and he cuts it. So we didn't even get to say a few words really prior to the ribbon cutting, because he was ready to go. It was on schedule. But he was we were very relieved that he was proud of what we did. Um, it's one thing to build an exhibit for someone who isn't still alive, um, because you hope that you're going to honor them. You hope you're telling the right stories. But when you're doing it with someone who's alive, they can hate you. So, and Frank would if he didn't like it. So we wanted to make sure he approved of everything. And having Frank Borman say that he's proud of you is something that I don't think any of us were prepared for. Um, as we're closing out here, Frank went back. We talked about every week and a half. We had a phone call. We just chat, and he spent a lot of time with Susan, who was suffering from dementia. Unfortunately, we lost Susan first, and we lost Frank shortly after. As a matter of fact, we lost Frank during the fall boards that day. Um, these are just a couple quotes that I wrote down as we were spending time together. I would take little notes of something, little nuggets of wisdom that he would leave me. And having Frank, I told my wife once, I said, I don't know what to do, but I think I'm friends with Frank Borman. I don't want to just assume. And she was laughing, and she was like, "Well, he's just calling to talk to you?" And I said, "Yeah." And then we just started spending time together, and actually would visit one another. And I have to say thanks in my final slide to EA, because um, it's a very special place that would allow me to have that relationship. There's a lot of places that would not allow that freedom. I'm very thankful that they did. And it was a friendship I never expected, and one that I will forever cherish. So I know we ran a little long here. I'm going to hand it back over to Paul, but I just want to say thank you guys for letting me talk about Frank, and a moment in my career, my life here, that I will always be proud of, and will always cherish in a special place.
Chris, once again, another phenomenal presentation. We so much enjoy having you, and thank you very much for coming together with a 2 week notice and saying, "Oh, yeah, I got something for you."
Well, thanks. I hope I didn't put anybody to sleep. So
No, you did very well. There was a question about the 104 that's in the NASM collection that's in storage. It's a NASA 104, but it wasn't an NF 104. And in the docent guide, we've got the list of some of the astronauts who flew it, including 3 of the Apollo astronauts.
wow.
John Handy wants to know, did Frank Borman actually say it was Lovell who lost the toothbrush, Chris? I saw an interview with Lovell, and he was very evasive about it.
So it was one of those moments where it was one of those moments where they played it off one another, say, "Well, one of us lost it," but Frank always kind of insinuated that it was Lovell that did.
Okay.
But yeah.
John goes on to say the toothbrush was donated to National Museum of American History by Susan's mother, who was a dental hygienist and has been in storage for years.
That's
Um,
wild.
and our Gemini curator didn't even know it was there.
Wow.
John wants to know, did Frank select level for Apollo 8 crew, and were they best friends until he passed away?
Frank definitely got to select his crew to a certain point. I mean, it had to, of course, get through Deke, but he had asked to have Lovell on his crew. Again, that was a Deke thing, but he would have some input. Let's put it that way. And they absolutely remained best friends. You know, we would. There were times where I would be talking to Frank, and he'd be like, "Let's call Lovell," and we would call Jim Lovell. I mean, it was a friendship that I never saw coming. And I've always felt like it was really odd that I had this front row seat where we would call somebody else or and he was a great what I would call like sort of like grief giver I'll clean it up that way. And he would get a twinkle in his eye when he was going to give you crap about something. You would actually see this twinkle in his eye, and you're like, "Here it comes," and he would have something fun to say. I remember sitting at breakfast with him one morning in Montana, and so when he would come to Oshkosh, we were busy, right? So we had all kinds of stuff to do, so we wouldn't always eat on time. Keep in mind, Frank's a schedule guy. So when we're in Montana, it's a lot easier because we're not doing air venture. We were doing different things, and he would get this twinkle in his eye, and he goes, "You see what time it is?" And I'd say, "Yeah." And he goes, "It's breakfast time. We're eating breakfast." And he goes, "And it's good food, not that stuff you give me when I'm in Wisconsin." So he would just have an absolute blast with that. He called one time, and I had Jennifer Lavasser with me in the car, and he asked Jennifer, he goes, "Did you bring a sandwich? Because he's not going to feed you while you're there, just so you know." And she always thought that was pretty funny. So
Okay. Scott Marquis has his hand up. Go ahead, Scott.
Chris, we've had the pleasure and the honor of listening to you many times over the past few years. And I was thinking that as I was listening to you, yeah, I've heard about Jim Lovell's life. Correction, Frank Borman's life, this way, that way, history wise. But I think this is perhaps your best presentation with us because not only you're giving us the history of what everybody knows, but this is what I did with him. So it makes it personal. And that kind of snuck through. I don't know if that's the correct term, but I thought it's, I think, like I said, it's your best presentation I've heard of you.
I really appreciate that. That means a lot coming from you. So thank you. That it's I never want it to sound I worry that I never want it to sound like braggy, like I got to spend this time with this guy or anything like that. It's just more of this is what happened, it's like somehow I became friends with Abraham Lincoln, or something like that. It's the best way I could explain it. But he was. I will say this: you can't be friends with someone like him and make it and not have an influence on you. I wanted to be a better person, a better leader here at work, and a better spouse at home because of him. I mean that I'll tell you guys a little story real quick. I don't really tell a lot of people, but I'll tell y'all, I got on a journey to try to trim down and drop some weight, over the last few years. And I was talking to Frank one day about it that I was starting. And he goes, "Oh, what do you do?" And I was like, "Well, you have to do this. And you're supposed to get an accountability buddy." And Frank's like, "Well, I'll be your accountability buddy." And I'm like, "Frank, that's ridiculous. I'm not making you my accountability buddy for this." And he did. Every week I had to check in with him on my weight, which was completely ridiculous. And he had a saying that was, if the number is ever higher than the week before, I'm going to come and beat you up. And as a matter of fact, that was one of the last things he said to me was, just remember, you got to keep going down or I will come beat you up. That's a cleaned up version of what he would say to me. But yeah, but he was, it was life changing to be friends with him.
Chris, one more question that's in the chat.
Yeah.
Story that NASA wanted Frank Borman to continue past Apollo 8 and perhaps be the commander for the first moon landing. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. As a matter of fact, we have the flight suit from the LEM trainer. Was it the LLRV? I'm sorry if I have the wrong letters there, but he did fly the sim. There's actually footage of him online flying one of the sims, a very weird one that I had never seen. It's made out of like a modified Bell 47. But he did. He was actually offered command by Deke. He turned it down. And his exact quote was, "I didn't want to risk my life to pick up a bunch of rocks." He said, I had seen what happened when the family of the White family lost their sort of anchor point, and I didn't want to do that to Susan and my kids. I flew Apollo 8. It was a Cold War mission. We wanted to beat Russia. We were now ahead of Russia, and I felt good about coming off flight rotation. He stayed with NASA through Apollo 13, though, as an advisor.
Okay. Chris, that takes care of all the questions other than great comments. Everyone thought it was outstanding, as it always is.
Thank you.
For the docents on board, our next one will be the second Monday in April. I think that's April 13th. It will be on the Custer Channel Wing. We have one of the prototypes of the Custer Channel Wing in our collection. It's in storage. And we got Joel Custer will come on. He's the grandson of the designer of the Custer Channel Wing. So I look forward to that. Chris, I look forward to seeing you at the board meeting.
Same here.
Enjoy the rest of your spring day. Thanks, everybody.
See you guys. Thank you for having me.